School. We've all been there. It's boring, mundane, repetitive, and most often not catered to how we learn best. But why does it have to be that way? It was always status quo until I met a teacher that would flip my experience on its head. Mr. Akins. His class was different. He knew that students were capable of so much more than we had been given credit for. Topics were brought to life, and curiosity, discussion, debate turned his class into the best part of my day. I was tired of sharing stories about Mr. Akins and the crucial impact it had on my love for learning, so I've decided to bring him to everyone. This is the Best Teacher I've Ever Had podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of the Best Teacher I've Ever Had podcast. I'm Ryan. This is Eric. We're so excited to see everyone back.
Welcome, everyone. Great to not see you, but perhaps to be seen by you and heard.
I agree. We're in a new year. We talked on the podcast about kind of the origins of getting things started. And what was frustrating is we kind of had this lag time between when we recorded topics and then when they actually got released. And so we're trying to close that gap immensely so that we can actually have feedback from the community. And we wanted to also take a quick opportunity on this episode to really just thank everyone who has tuned in from the first couple episodes in the release. It was really, inspiring and encouraging to see so many people interact from different social media platforms to texts I got to comments about the show. I mean, really just genuine.
Yeah, tens of thousands, I believe, right? It's incredible. Yeah, the response has been overwhelming.
Millions of Instagram followers, and so as part of that, it's been such a great opportunity to really get the opportunity. I think I've even had some people who I went to school with who were really jealous of the idea of getting to spend time with Mr. Akins again, and I think that's where my love for this opportunity comes in first and foremost. So as part of that, I wanted to run through just a few logistics and things that as I'm now getting back into the episodes, I'm realizing may not be so clear as we're talking. So when new episodes release, there's a couple different ways that you can watch them. If you want to watch the podcast, YouTube is the content platform. So on the website, bestteacherpodcast.com, we have embedded video as well as links to all the places you can watch that. So a link to the YouTube channel, a link to Apple Podcasts, to Spotify, anywhere that you want to consume it, it's available. So don't feel like you have to watch it on YouTube. Don't feel like you have to watch it on the website or listen to it. You can search it in Apple Podcasts. It'll come up. You can search it in Spotify. And then YouTube is where you can consume the video portion. And what some of you may have not realized, which I got some nice feedback, is we're starting to add some images and overlays into the content. So as we talk about an area or a historic person, using a map, using a picture, an illustration, these are reasons why the video portion might be interesting to those who want to tune in and actually not only see our beautiful faces, but see some content and get hopefully some context that I know sometimes for me at least, Eric, like listening to dates and regions without a visual can be frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the death knells, I think, of any history class is when names and dates and names of territories and places and people and it becomes this mind-numbing, dreaded ordeal rather than something which is engaging to the spirit and mind and body. So
agreed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'll try to do that as best as possible. So tune in, and if you want to just listen, great. We're going to do our best to try to also draw and use descriptive language to make a picture and a visual that hopefully you can kind of imagine yourselves in the area or the content. So first and foremost, that's how you can watch the podcast. And if you have any challenges, Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube are going to be your home bases, and then bestteacherpodcast.com is where we update everything and have links there. The second part is for those who were interested, I got a couple different inquiries on. We mentioned supporting the show. We mentioned subscribing to the podcast, and maybe made the error of knowing that there's lots of ways to support and subscribe. So subscribing on YouTube means one thing, or following a podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts means something else. So please do that on those. Leave reviews. Those help the show. Additionally, if you want to support the podcast financially, we have a podcast subscription and a podcast donation that are on the main website. these are different than subscribing to YouTube. This is a way for you to actually support at any level that you want. The content is always going to be free. We want to make sure the episodes are available for everyone, but we are going to do some additional things for those who support the show. So episodes, you'll get access early. So we're going to release new episodes to those who support the show early. We're going to do some additional content. Teaser, we're actually going to talk about one time in high school when I got 3 Saturday schools within a 20-second window.
Not my fault.
And my experiences attending all 3 of those Saturday schools. So a little bit more of a modern day Breakfast Club with maybe not as much of a nice ending. And so
which character were you? Were you the Judd Hirsch?
I was definitely Molly Ringwald. I mean,
yeah, I figured you were the red hair, the whole.
I mean, I was in my peak
coquettish
course.
demeanor.
So that's going to be for people who are podcast members only. So on the website, you can see it there. We're going to do some additional content, maybe some. We want to do some Ask Me Anything opportunities with Eric, where students who have been in the class, we can actually go through and ask those questions that maybe we couldn't ask while we were within the walls of the high school.
Well, and I don't know if I shall answer.
And we may have to.
Yeah, it depends on the.
We may
question.
have to plead the fifth to some of these. So we're going to do stuff like that, as well as future opportunities for just additional content. So if you're interested, I'll put some overlays here of those specifically on the website. I just wanted to call out these are separate. So as part of that, if you donate to the podcast at any level, either from a membership or a one-time donation, there is an option to add a message to basically share if you'd like a story about a teacher or a mentor or someone who influenced you that we'll actually read as part of the show. So I have one that I'd like to read from a good friend of the podcast, Landon, who actually took Mr. Aiken's class a couple different times, including Shakespeare and AP European History. And so...
Yeah, and I had him in English as well. Prior to that, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I got that. I'll have to confirm. So,
or Euros history. Yeah.
So Landon writes for the podcast, one memory that has really stuck with me was how gently and subtly Aikens would re-engage the attention of students who were distracted or talking in class. He would, without dropping a beat, say, for example, as Landon was just telling Kristen about the French Revolution, hearing your name, of course, caught your attention, and by not interrupting his flow, he immediately brought your focus back into the discussion and did so without punishing the rest of the class by stopping the lecture to reprimand. It was so simple, and yet it was the only teacher I've ever seen able to pull it off in that way. To me, it was a hallmark of Mr. Aiken's class, a true master of his craft.
Well, thank you, Landon. That was, and I remember you quite fondly, I think, if I could remember you. Yeah, I'm sure it would be very fondly. No, I know, Landon.
Yeah, and
he always sat in the front row, I believe, right to my right, as I would sit there and hold forth and wax eloquent. Landon would be sitting there just usually riveted, hardly ever distracted. But
yeah, I love that because it's I remember very similar, a way to say, one, to engage someone, to make them feel included, and to remind them that, hey, your time is everyone's time, including the class. And so great ways, and hopefully a good example for others who are looking for ways, how do you re-engage someone or a class that's just maybe got distracted or just needs a little bit of a wake up.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's funny because I had not thought of, those were techniques that just came to me naturally through life lessons, I believe. And yeah, because and of course you have to it almost works with everyone, because it's one of those techniques that immediately makes the person who's the target laugh and be part of the joke instead of being the butt of the joke. And I tried to make Landon the butt of the joke quite often because he deserved it, but no, just that sense, right, that you could make, and then everyone else in the class too who would get it, and the idea that as if they were really just so engaged, they were having this private conversation about Marat and Danton, the French Revolution, and this tremendous impact it has on their high school lives. So that's. So thank you, Landon. That's a fantastic observation and memory. And,
yes, and thank you.
It warms the cockles.
For supporting the show. It means a lot. As well as there's an option, too, just for everyone who's interested. If you want to submit a message or support the podcast, there's also check boxes that you can say, hey, please don't read my message on the podcast, or read my message but keep it anonymous. And we'd love to do that as well if you'd like to contribute or share about someone who made an impact.
Yeah.
So thank you kindly. So today... we're going to transition a little bit, and I'm trying to put on my hat of remembrance because the the last episode, we dealt with Alexander the Great and a pretty impressive conquest. And I think what's interesting, and Eric, the question I want to ask for you is, I clearly remembered learning about Alexander the Great, and not just in your class, but in other history classes I've had. But
Sure.
I honestly could not, and probably still couldn't to this day, except for maybe some recent reading, like really tell you like how that transition happened from the peak of his empire to all of a sudden the Romans being kind of the powerhouse. It's just kind of, oh yeah, this happened, and then some period of time passed, and then the Romans were the next kids on the block. So talk me through a little bit of how do we set the stage here before, obviously, we want to talk a little bit about Rome.
Yeah, you can't say Rome.
Oh, sorry.
Right. Do you remember
that's
that from
right.
class? What was the idea that I tried to inculcate?
Let's see if I can. Rome.
Rome, the glory of Rome, an eternal thought in the mind of God. Rome, like Shakespeare. When we took Shakespeare, you can't just say Shakespeare. You have to say Shakespeare. And Rome, right? So the glory of Rome. Well, yeah, that's a great idea. That's a fantastic way to launch the Roman Empire. Alexander the Great. He died in. Here we go. A date. Yeah, we'll start with a date.
I gotta find a map
like that. Yeah, and we got to have the chronology. And so, 323 BC, 323 years. Well, it's actually, of course, if we're going to when that Jesus fellow really may have been born, it would be 319 years before the birth of Jesus, because he was probably born in 4 BC. But anyway, so he died in 323. He was only 33 years old, Alexander the Great. However, the thrust of the last episode was not just his conquest. The significance of his conquest was the Greeks, the spreading of the Greek way of looking at the world. This idea that the world is governed by physical laws, and that science is something that is real and works and is the best way of engaging the world. And so now it wasn't just Greece. If you look at a world globe like we have back here, or a map, is really small. It's a small country. But Alexander's empire was huge, and he created dozens of cities with the Greek way of being and seeing in the world. And so that was the significance, right, of Alexander's conquest, the real importance of what he accomplished, and particularly the center in Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile River in the southeastern Mediterranean Sea. With the museum there in Alexandria, the great library, and the professors and rhetoricians and the scientists and mathematicians and the other great thinkers who followed in the legacy of the Golden Age of Athens. And so this story in the 3rd century BC, we're talking about the 200s. So maybe we're talking 50, 60 years, 70 years really after the death of Alexander. And what had happened to Alexander's empire, if you recall from the last episode, with his death, which is so common when a fantastic charismatic leader dies, their empire falls apart, is divided up. It was with Charlemagne, it was with Alexander the Great, and it was with Napoleon. It's probably the 3 prime examples in history. And Alexander the Great's empire was divided up into 3 different government entities, sovereign states within the empire, the old empire. And Egypt was one of them, Alexandria in Egypt. And so this center in Alexandria really promoted the idea of the scientific method of study, of the love of the intellect, the philosophies, Epicureanism, Stoicism, which were things I don't think I really discussed very much in the last episode. But these were philosophies. These were not sciences that developed during the Hellenistic period. Stoicism began in Athens under a fellow named Zeno. Zeno's paradox is famous. Do you know Zeno's paradox?
It's familiar. Remind me.
It's an idea. It can be used different ways. The most common one is that an archer shoots an arrow at a target, and you're going to calculate when it reaches the target. And of course, one way of calculating is how far it goes in half the distance. So if it's 90 yards, let's say, so after 45 yards, how far does it go? And so you say half a second, okay, whatever it is. And then you divide it in half again. And you divide it in half again and again. And the problem with that mathematical method is, what does the arrow never achieve?
The actual distance,
you keep dividing. It never gets to the target. So Zeno's paradox. So he was a mathematician, but he was also a philosopher. Keep in mind that the Greek word philosopher is a lover of wisdom, a lover of learning. That's what it means. Philo, the Greek word for love. Sophia, a word for wisdom or knowledge. Wisdom is better. And so Zeno started the school of Stoicism, which really emphasized the whole idea of just the world is made up of atoms. We are physical beings. There is adversity. There is pleasure. There are both. And so just take them both with a Stoic mindset. The word comes from that. The school that he taught at was called the Stoa, which was a colonnade at the foot of the Acropolis in Athens. And that's what a Stoa was in Greek. And so Stoics were named after that. And we have the word still, Stoicism, right? Most people know that. Oh, he's very stoic. Right. And it means someone who has a very calm demeanor. They don't tend to get rattled, worked up. And Stoicism had a huge impact upon the Romans. This was probably the governing philosophy or psychological mindset of the Roman Empire. It was the ideal to which the patrician Romans worked and they desired to fulfill. That the world, basically you take in stride, and that's the best way to conquer it and to overcome it, because they wanted to overcome it. The Greeks wanted to accept it, imbibe it, and to just savor it and understand it. The Romans wanted to bring it to their knees and basically overcome it, like I said earlier. There's a better way to say that, but we'll leave it with that for now. And the other one was Epicureanism. Epicureanism by Epicurus. This, again, is in the Hellenistic world, 4th century BC into the 3rd century BC, so we're talking the 200s. And he said that since we're all going to die and our bodies are going to go back to dust and to their atoms, just enjoy life. And I think I did discuss this in one of the episodes. And he to him, Epicureanism, to enjoy life, to savor life's pleasures, because we're all going to die, that life is all there is. And so why not enjoy it? For him, that meant philosophy. That meant philosophical meditation, enjoying the company of a few very close and good friends, and engage in philosophical reflection. So we had the mathematical mindset, the scientific mindset going in Alexandria. We still had the philosophies going in Greece. And then we had a guy named Archimedes. And Archimedes was in a Greek colony in southern Italy. And this is basically your question. I finally get to it, right? Italy, where a city-state called Rome had been expanding throughout this peninsula, the Italian peninsula. And in the 3rd century, in the midst, about the time they were taking on the Carthaginian Empire across the Mediterranean Sea in North Africa, they were conquering the Italian peninsula. In fact, it's a little bit prior to the Carthaginian Wars, which are called the Punic Wars. And they were conquering the city-state of Syracuse, and that's where Archimedes, the greatest scientist and mathematician, one of the greatest mathematicians to ever have lived, he calculated pi, and I think we did get into that, amongst many of his achievements. But believe it or not, in the midst of the Roman conquest of his city, Syracuse, he had been on what he thought was the cusp of some great epiphany, mathematical epiphany. And he was in his backyard working. He had these tabula, these slates that they would work on in either wax or in sand. And he was doing frantically these mathematical calculations. And a Roman legionnaire who knew about this very important figure in the city of Syracuse and had been sent to the house of Archimedes to take him under control, and found him working in the backyard. And Archimedes was completely ignoring this legionnaire. He was still working, God bless him, in the Greek way on his mathematics. He wasn't going to stop for some ridiculous soldier ordering him to in some barbaric language that he didn't understand, Latin, right? What the heck is Latin? And the legionnaire, the Roman man of action, looked at this, what he considered to be this pompous Greek aristocrat who was not obeying the rules and the laws of Rome. He cut him in half. He chopped him in half. He got his sword out. His gladius, that's the Roman word, the Latin word for sword, and killed him. And so this is a great moment, and it's also a great metaphor for how different the Romans were and the way they approached the world compared to the Greek ideal. The Romans used that story as a motivational tool, that when someone, of course, is not obeying the rules and the laws and the propriety of society, you take care of them. You do what is right and just and rub them out. And this is something a lot of Americans go, yeah, right. This. A lot of Americans can relate to that Roman ideal, that Roman notion. And the Greek, of course, he was on the pursuit of some great intellectual discovery. And so why would he stop for some ridiculous purpose such as conquest? And so it's a great starting point. And that was the time. So when we're looking at when the Greek world was being overcome by the Romans, it was in the 3rd century BC. At the same time that the Romans were engaging their biggest enemy, adversary, foe, which was the Carthaginian Empire, which will certainly be part of our discussion, if not tonight, in some other episode.
Yeah, so just to clarify, I think that's the point that maybe it's just so I don't miss. So while Alexander was still still doing his thing in conquest, the Romans, and we'll talk about this in terms of the origin story, but they were essentially coming to age. They just hadn't made enough disruption to actually catch Alexander's eye, correct?
No, right. They had not expanded beyond the Italian peninsula. When Alexander died in 323 BC, the Romans were in the process of conquering. It wasn't just conquest; they were brilliant politicians and administrators and fantastic organizers of society, and they created a series of alliances with other areas of the Italian peninsula, at the time, which were other states, other peoples, other languages, other cultures in the Italian city. Because to the north of Rome was one of their rivals, what were the people who were called the Etruscans, who had actually dominated Rome for centuries and were the first civilization of the Italian peninsula. And then the Greeks actually were the second civilization in southern, when they created over 50 colonies in the polis, which were their city-states. So they had all of southern Italy, including Sicily, the island at the toe of the Italian boot, were all completely controlled by the Greeks. The Romans referred to it as Magna Graecia. So we get that word Graecia, which is the Roman word for Greece. And that's why because for the most part, we've inherited Roman words, and so we call them the Greeks instead of Hellenes, which the Greeks call themselves. So, yeah, when Alexander was finished, when he died, the Romans were expanding. They were already a player to be reckoned with. They had not, however, ever encountered. What if Alexander, and this is a fascinating question, what if he had gone west instead of east? What if he had gone west into Italy and eradicated and conquered and co-opted and assimilated the people of the Italian peninsula? And to think that there never would have been a Rome? That's an intriguing idea, right? Just the quirks and oddities of history. And there was a reason he went east, and it was the Persian Empire. The Greeks had always been engaged. The Persians had been their nemesis. And so he wanted to go and say, okay, look, you guys, it's our turn. You invaded us twice. We defeated you. Now I'm coming. I'm coming for you. And he got them. And but it is interesting. And of course, Alexander was the ideal for the Romans. Every great Roman statesperson, general, leader modeled himself after Alexander. Wanted to look like him on the coins, in any kind of bust or portrait, fresco, a mosaic. Alexander Great was deified in their minds, and he was this figure of myth. He was as much a part as real to them. Well, he was real to them, of course, but in the way that Hercules, they equated the two, right? That these figures, Achilles and Hector and Hercules and Theseus, and then Alexander the Great. And so to them, this is what the Roman generals, and then when it became an empire with emperors, they aspired to be the next Alexander.
And I think we understand that a little bit from when certain individuals, die at the peak of their height or their talent, or they become immortalized in a way that they probably wouldn't have if they had lived on and died, slowly from some disease. And so it's interesting that your question is, what if he made a different Rome? Possibly, but the fact that he died, and when he died, the influence likely was way bigger than what maybe he would have done squandering, who knows, the next 20 or 30 years.
Right, his empire. Maybe it wasn't his presence that kept the empire together. Maybe if he had survived, because basically when Alexander died, he had already stopped expanding. He had begun his I won't call it a retreat, but is returned back to Greece. And he was about halfway back, and he got this fever. It lasted 9 days or so, and eventually he died. So it's intriguing to think, right? That's a really good point. And we do that with our celebrities, don't we?
I think it's hilarious.
Freddie Mercury or John Lennon, of course, especially if you're assassinated, something like that happens. We do that with political figures, celebrities, whomever, politicians. It's our presidents. Although it is intriguing that there are McKinley and Garfield, a couple of presidents who have been assassinated, that people go, who? When William McKinley was assassinated in 1901, people say, well, the most important thing about that is that Teddy Roosevelt then became president, which is really unfair to William McKinley. He had already served a term, was a fine fellow, and wasn't a terrible president. But nonetheless, Teddy Roosevelt may be one of the certainly top 3 or 4. That's why he's on Mount Rushmore.
And what's funny about your comparison there is, as much as the Romans loved Alexander, Alexander loved the Greeks. So it's kind of funny how the people, the culture or the people that you grew up with, to your point of who you memorialize and kind of who you idolize, ends up being that influence that obviously in this case they took on longer.
Yeah, it begs the question: was Macedonia Greek? And it's still to this day. Of course, Macedonians would say no. Well, yes, but no. It's like the British, are they European? No. Well,
sometimes.
Yes, in fact. Well, no, we're not American, but so it's those ideas of identity are always intriguing and complex to an idea, right? And so, good point. Yeah. So Rome. To you, Rome, if we think about it in the popular media, if we think about the images of Rome, what are some of the images of Rome that strike you before we actually begin talking about the specifics, the dates, the overall picture? But because I think every American, every listener, every viewer of this podcast and anything else on Rome that they come across in the media or in books, which is a medium, what are some of the things you think about when you think of ancient Rome?
I mean, I think obviously the first thing that comes to my mind is just the movie Gladiator, obviously immortalized that great visualization, but it's the architecture and the war and the armor,
which we've copied, right?
The war, the armor, obviously the buildings, which were heavily influenced from the Greeks, but these great pieces of architecture and the stadium and
the Colosseum, right? The Pantheon, the aqueducts, these incredible
highways,
works of engineering. Yeah, roads that are still some of the finest ever built in Europe. It's this. And the dress. I thought about that. We should probably do that for the paying subscribers. We should do it at the same episode, dress in togas. We can do that sort of as over Photoshop in togas and tunics and the Roman sandals.
Okay. Make it happen.
Wearing the laurel wreaths or golden wreaths. Yeah, so all of these things that we can. Ben-Hur, right?
Chariots,
a lot of people have seen that movie and the sequel, Ben-Him, right, which was not as popular.
Also,
but the chariot race
and
right?
democracy, senators. I mean, that type of that structure. I think of very much in the Roman time period.
Yeah, legal the Latin language,
Latin,
which is so much. Arguably, well, over about 20 some odd % of English is derived from Latin, usually filtered through the French.
The Caesars, obviously, the Caesars are a big piece as well.
Yeah, who's the most famous Caesar of all? It's a name that everyone knows.
Julius,
it's like Napoleon Julius Caesar is more famous than Alexander the Great. It's a name that people are more familiar with, right? And so, that's something. And then there's Augustus Caesar, and there's figures like Cicero. Do you remember the name of the gladiator who was a slave who in 71 BC staged a rebellion, and there was a famous movie with Kirk Douglas and Tony Curtis about that?
Oh.
When I say it, you'll remember
the name.
It's one of the great movies about Rome, Spartacus.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I Am Spartacus. And that's a movie people out there, if you haven't seen, certainly equal to Gladiator and a forerunner. And Ridley Scott, the director of Gladiator, always tipped his hat to the movie Spartacus, one of the great movies, let alone a movie about Rome, ancient Rome. So, I think Ben-Hur, Spartacus, and Gladiator are the 3 most iconic examples of visual movies representations. There was a TV series to HBO, I think. I don't know. I'm not trying to give any kind of
recommendations here.
I think it was HBO. It may not have been. I don't know. But it's just called Rome. And it was very well done as well. Very, very graphic. And of course, what it portrayed is violence and nudity. because those were aspects which were also part of the Roman experience, as they are experience of every society. But when people think of Rome, if I ask a question of someone who knows anything about Rome, would we say that they were a society that were violent and that violence was an important part of their way of being in the world? And if we think about the things that are famous, what would our answer have to be?
Oh, yeah, that's right. The arena is arguably one of the most famous things.
Yeah, we think of conquest and we think of the gladiatorial games, right? That the most popular form of entertainment were the chariots.
Right.
And then second were the gladiators. Before theater, they weren't Greeks, right? They weren't Athenians. They loved theater. They loved the Greek theater. They did have some great Roman playwrights as well. But it was behind. That was more for the patricians, the aristocrats of Roman, the theater, than the common games, right? The gladiatorial games and then the chariot races. The chariot races were the obsession of Romans for hundreds of years, actually for 1,000 years. The chariot races were the dominant. There were 4 teams based on colors, and so the blue-greens were the 2 most foremost and famous of the factions, and then the red and whites were the other 4. These were the 4 factions for the chariot races. And then they would have, according to different provinces of the Roman Empire, and this is shown so beautifully in the movie Ben-Hur. So these are things we just know. In fact, scholars argue that the gladiatorial games were such an integral part of the Roman way of life because they needed to be reminded about the value of strength, of conquest, of violence, that they had their affluence, their prosperity, their way of life thanks to this empire, thanks to their legions. And so these were nearly daily reminders of that fact. Oftentimes the games, more often than not, would stage reenactments of famous Roman victories. And so these are really fascinating aspects of this, probably the greatest, most ultimate empire in human history. You can think of Genghis Khan or others, but the fact is the Roman Empire, as the most powerful political entity in the world for nearly 7 centuries. That's unparalleled, right, in the history of humanity. At the height of the Roman Empire, 1/5 of the world's population lived within the Roman Empire. And this was in the western part of the world. It's not in that triangle of India and China where most of the world's population resides. Right. But so yeah, that's why I jokingly say Rome, right? This ultimate empire, this eternal thought in the mind of God.
Yeah,
that you must abase yourself before her, worship her.
And I think it can't be,
Rome.
And I think what we want to do and focus in this episode, and obviously the origins of really how things worked, and kind of where. I mean, and we could talk about a little bit about the myth versus legend versus the actuality, but it was kind of interesting circumstance that this all came and really how it flourished, and I think it'd be interesting to kind of. I'd love to check some of my assumptions against ultimately kind of a story of really kind of a settlement of people that were more similar to kind of a ragtag kind of penal colony, if you will, of people that basically didn't have a home. And I think that story is interesting too, as far as kind of they didn't come from some rich, or it didn't out of nowhere. It really the origin kind of comes from this legend and really coming back to the Trojans, from what I remember.
The origin story with our Marvel universe and our DC universe, and we become in our popular culture obsessed with origin stories, and we've used that's even become a catchphrase. The initial origin story of the Roman Empire. And they wanted to have one. They wanted to have one, the idea that they were ordained by the gods. Americans believe that, right? Our founding fathers, that we have a manifest destiny. We've used that expression. It was coined by James Polk, President Polk. And it is our manifest destiny to expand and to spread our way of culture, because we're such a perfectly moral culture, right? And so the world needs to bow to our greatness in that sense. And the Romans had that same sensibility. And they wanted to have this connection with the gods, with kind of magical, mystical denotations and connotations within the origin. And so the first one was Romulus and Remus, and the story of Romulus and Remus. And according to the Romans, now this was actually decided in the 3rd century BC, but the story happened in the 8th century. So we're talking about the 700s BC, 700 years before Christ. This is at the same time that the Olympic Games were beginning in Greece. This is at the same time that the Greek city-states were beginning to emerge out of the Greek Dark Ages we had talked about. Homer was in the year 800 BC. So in 753 BC, according to the Romans, the city of Rome was founded by a fellow named Romulus. Well, who's Romulus? The city's named after him, according to legend and myth, right? Makes sense. Romulus? Rome. Yeah. Oh, okay. Gotcha. Romulus and Remus were born. They were twins. And their mother was a woman named Rhea, who was the granddaughter of the king of a society called Alba. It's all in the Latium Valley. Latium, which is because it's the Latin or Latini people. These were people, of course, right in smack dab in the middle of the Italian peninsula on the western side of the Italian. So in the Tyrrhenian, what we call the Tyrrhenian Sea, Ligurian Sea to the north, all part of the Mediterranean Sea, all right? And this was all in the Tiber River Valley, the Latium people, the Latium Valley, the Tiber Valley. And Romulus and Remus were born to this woman who was a virgin. She was had never slept with a man. She was a Vestal virgin. She was one of the keepers of the hearth, which was one of the most important, Vesta, the goddess of the hearth and home. Very important because the family was at the core. It's one of the core defining principles of the Roman Empire and Roman society. And so the goddess of the hearth, Vesta, the Vesta temple in Rome for 1,000 years was one of the most sacred and important. They had the Vestal virgins. They had the eternal flame, which was in their temple, and they were the guardians of that eternal flame, and it could never go out. Else Rome itself would be extinguished.
Was this a life sentence? Not sentence, but with the Vestal virgins, is this for life? Is this for a short period of time?
It would change. No, they they tended they liked them young and liked them. So yeah, after they would have there'd be a head priestess, Vestal virgin, who tended to be a matron, and then the 5 or 12 they would have novices as well. So not unlike, of course, a Christian convent later on. They functioned very much like nuns did in the Christian world and still do. And the Vestal virgins, there was all sorts of punishments for them if they were ever found to have slept with men. So that's why, of course, the mother had to be a virgin. And it was the god Mars. Ares was the Greek god of war. The Romans named him Mars and found her in the sacred grove. Rhea Silvium is her name. And she was the granddaughter of the king of this society, which was very close to where Rome was founded by the grandson, Romulus. And so she was sleeping in the sacred grove and was visited by the Roman god Mars, and he impregnated her, and she gave birth to these twin boys. Well, in the meantime, this brother, or actually I should say nephew to the king, the grandfather of Romulus and Remus, so their uncle, he had taken over the I'll call it a city-state, all right? The state called Alba. I'll call it Alba, just a Latin word for white, because there are white hills above the Tiber, Latium Valley. And this uncle had taken over, seized control from the rightful king, according to the Roman legend, the grandfather of Romulus and Remus. And this uncle was afraid of the fact that these, not only were the fact, of course, were they the grandsons of the king that he had usurped, but they were the sons of the Roman god of war. And so he was very much daunted by the fact that they might, when they came of age, take his power, seize his power. So he seized them. He seized control. He took them. He ordered his soldiers to kidnap them from the mother. He put them into a basket and set them adrift on the river Tiber. This sounds just like the Moses story, doesn't it? It's one of those archetype stories that Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, talked about and Joseph Campbell developed. And so they drifted down the river, and they drifted into what is now the city of Rome. And oddly enough, the first being to find them was a SheWolf. And we always say SheWolf. It's always fantastic. We don't say a wolf. We don't say a female wolf. We call her a SheWolf. And this SheWolf found them, dragged them out of the basket. She suckled them, brought them back to her cave in the Palatine Hill, right? Yes, the Palatine Hill in Rome, called the Lupercal, which is just means wolf, the wolf cave. And it became one of the most important sacred sites in Rome. Still there, you can go see it, the water dripping down through the cavern walls. And So she suckled Romulus and Remus and saved their lives, right, with her she-wolf milk. And in the midst of all this, then a shepherd found them. Faustulus, the shepherd, found them and raised them, Romulus and Remus. So sort of like the story of Oedipus, right, that had been accidentally found and then raised separately. And Romulus and Remus, sure enough, when they grew up, they became figures to be reckoned with. And when they grew up, they sided with Numitor, who was their grandfather, who was still alive. They didn't know that he was their grandfather. They just had a sense that he was the rightful king of Alba. And then as they came into their own, in their young manhood, into their power, I could go. The story goes on, and basically the premise of it is that Romulus and Remus defeated their uncle Amulius, and they, of course, restored their grandfather to his rightful place as king of Alba, and they decided to found their own city then. And so they went back to where the she-wolf, to the Palatine Hill, to where the place that they had been saved, and basically came ashore on the Tiber River, much closer to the Mediterranean Sea. And the problem was Romulus and Remus both had different ideas about where the city should be founded, and it became a big problem. And they asked that there be an augur, that means to look at the signs from the gods about who's right. Should it be on the Palatine Hill where the Lupercal Cave is, or should it be on this other one which has a little bit better strategic value, the Aventine Hill? And in the end, Romulus won. And Remus got really upset, and he didn't like this one bit. And so they actually got into a quarrel, a fight, and either Romulus himself killed his brother, and this then gets to the whole Cain and Abel story again. And so Romulus was the one who won, got his way. The Palatine Hill became the main hill in Rome, in the sense that that's where the emperors and all the greatest, most powerful people lived. The Capitoline Hill is where the temples and the capital was, but that's later on. And Romulus, the notion is that he was given sort of the ordained by the gods that is in a single day, as far as he could walk or run, carrying a stick and dragging it in the dust, that would be the bounds of his kingdom. And he happened in a single day to be able to cover a tremendous amount of territory and bound the 7 hills of Rome. That's the famous 7 hills of Rome, in which the city is still founded. That's the center of Rome. And this is the founding myth. Romulus established it in 753. Now, interestingly enough, on the Palatine Hill, on the backside of the Palatine Hill, we have some of the earliest archaeological sites of real buildings, constructed, organized, impressive buildings. And they date back to the 8th century, which would correspond to the founding 753. And 753 for the Romans was year 1. Mm-hmm. So in their calends, which is a Roman Latin word, it begins 753. That was the first. For the Greeks, it was 776, the first Olympic Games. And so pretty comparable, even though the Greeks got organized and got going prior to the Romans, but very similar. And again, the Romans actually in that valley, in the Latin, there were people going back to 1400 BC, real settlements going 700 years prior to the mythical founding, and real founding, I suppose, of the city-state that would become Rome. And what's interesting is that the Romans themselves, these Latin people, the Latini people, these people who spoke the Latin language and became the Romans, at first did not have a written language, and so they were not literate until maybe the 6th or 5th century. And they adapted that Western Greek alphabet, which had been adapted and adopted by the Etruscan people. And the Etruscans, and I won't go belabor this point, I'm going on too long as it is. But when you look at the Italian, founding of Rome, 753, 8th century, what's going on in the Italian peninsula? To the north, all of Tuscany, this is where Florence and Milan and Torino, these cities, and even Venice, was all part of what's called the Etruscan Empire or Kingdom. Etruscan people, historians are not sure where they came from, but they were tremendous builders. They themselves were wildly impressive. They had a lot of contact with the Greeks. They had taken on many of the Greek gods themselves and introduced them to the Romans. So that's one of the reasons why, one of the conduits for the Romans, where they got the Greek gods. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, Ares became Mars, etc. Aphrodite became Venus. And oftentimes it was the Etruscans or the Greeks to the south. And then we had the Greek colonies starting in the 8th century BC as well. So we have the Greek colonies to the south the southern part of the boot of Italy, including the island of Sicily, which was entirely Greek. And then we have these Etruscan people. And Tuscany, which is where Florence, the city of Florence and Siena, that's where they are. They're named. It means Etruscan, Tuscany. It comes from that. So this was the political situation in the Italian peninsula at the time of the founding of Rome. And so we know that the Romans get it all. They eventually conquer the Etruscans to the north and the Greeks to the south. And this is how? How does this happen, right? Like you said, it was a humble agricultural village, series of villages in the Tiber River Valley, the Latium Valley. So how does this happen? And this is the question. The most famous book ever written about the Romans was by an English scholar, Edward Gibbon, in the 18th century. It was a 16-year effort of love, tremendous scholarship, 4,000 pages, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. And it was a must-read by any would-be scholar or student of the ancient world for 150 years. The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And it's intriguing, right? I think the reason why that's always been the emphasis is that we're all aware of how powerful Rome was. So how did such a powerful state decline and fall? And so that is why historians have always looked at that, and that has always been their way into looking at and viewing the Roman Empire is this eventual, how did they fall? How did mighty Caesar fall? How did Rome fall? But to me, I think a more intriguing question is, how did it endure so long? How are they so successful? What was it about them that made them so effective and efficient? And the fact that they endured as a state from 753, we'll say, until nearly the year 500, that's 1,250 years. And that's just in the western part of the empire. The Roman Empire continued in the east, in the eastern Mediterranean, for another 1,000 years, up until the 1400s, but that's a story for later on. It's a 1,200-year-long successful society. The United States were, just a little over 200 years. We're getting there, right? Nearly 250 years now. But we've only been the world's great power for, since the end of World War II. So we're talking 70-some-odd years, 77 years. The Romans were, they had their founding in 753. They were not the Mediterranean basin's greatest power until 250 BC. Well, they fell around the year 500. So how long? Do the math. That's 750 years that the Roman Empire was the most powerful state in the Western world. 750 years. That would take us back to the 1200s. Imagine if the United States had been around as the world's technological, engineering, sophisticated state for 750 years and not 75 years. So this is the amazing thing about Rome, the legacy of Rome, and why it is so important and why it's embedded in everybody's psyche. And virtually everyone, even throughout the world, not just in the Western world, is aware of the Roman Empire and the importance and names like Julius Caesar. You resonate so powerfully still to this day, over 2,000 years after his death. And so I guess that could be something we look at today as this overview. The other, and I know the other founding myth, as the Romans began to become really successful, and they began they had another founding myth, which they interwove with the story of Romulus and Remus, because they realized by the time that they were a great empire that Romulus and Remus was kind of a little bit of a corny, there were elements of it that just were sort of ridiculous, not sublime. And so they wanted something a little grander, another myth, origin story that could basically make them as glorious as the Greeks themselves, who were connected. The Greeks had Homer, they had the Iliad and the Odyssey, these tremendous epic poems, not this silly little story about a she-wolf, right, and a shepherd. So they wanted something that would make the story of Romulus and Remus resonate with this gift from the gods, truly ordained as Rome was the greatest state, was heaven on earth. And as you know, this other story was written by a poet named Virgil during the reign of Caesar Augustus. And shall I let you give the name, the story?
Yeah, I can't remember the name, the poem, and I can't remember, I'll butcher the pronunciation of his poem, but this essentially goes back to Aeneas of Troy, right?
Yeah, and this is called the
Aeneid, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the play. It's the poetic play. It's really it's very much Shakespearean. We'll call it that. It rivals Homer. It rivals. It became a play. It was written originally as an epic poem, and then it was turned into a play as well. And so, but certainly an epic poem by Virgil, the great epic poet, who was the greatest, arguably the greatest. I prefer Horace myself. Reading a book of Horace's, a poet, a Roman poet, and from the 1st century BC, and his epistles, his letters right now, which are just incredible. But so they have this other great epic story. But before we get to that, let's do a little bit more of the real history, and I'll do it pretty quick. I'll try to be quicker. Sorry, people out there.
I think we'll set the stage.
Rome, it's just such a vast story.
Yeah, I think we'll set the stage.
So
we'll set the stage today, and then we'll.
I'll do sort of a wash, right now to give this gloss of the Roman Empire. And again, I'll be throwing out these dates, just trying to keep a temporal, some kind of context for when we're talking about. And I'll be connecting it up with Greeks, the Greek people, to what's going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. So really, if you look at that, okay, the success, the Romans, how did this little society with such humble beginnings, a guy dragging a stick in the dirt, how does it become the world's greatest ultimate empire? Well, I'll tell you, as much as I can do so succinctly and engagingly. They had to take on, of course, as they developed, they were very ambitious. Another founding myth that happened in the 8th centuries, they realized they were a very small society. And they needed, they couldn't just be so inbred. And so there's a story of the Sabine. Sabine is a beautiful area, which is Sabina or Sabine, which is very close to Rome. We're talking about 20, 30 miles. And they were an early rival. This is at the time of Romulus. And they realized, I know what we can do. Let's go get some of the Sabine women. We'll get the women there, bring them in, and then we'll have fresh blood. And they didn't know about DNA, right, and gene sequence and interbreeding and any of that, but they did not the details, but they did know, of course, about you need to have fresh blood. And so they got into a war and they conquered them and brought the Sabine women back. And they actually became they had agreed to in order to save some of the men, they had agreed to go willingly to Rome. And so this was just one of the stories. One of the first stories was the idea that Rome began to come into fruition and success by conquest. And so it became one of their governing principles, this idea that we must continue to expand and to add new blood and new territory in order to succeed. That to them it became the definition of success, that they were ordained by the gods. And so it was an obligation, and they also saw it as a civilizing obligation, that they themselves, as the inheritors of the gods, it was their duty, their manifest destiny, if you will, to use that old expression, which is very racist, the white man's burden. In this case, they would see it as the Latin burden to spread Latin civilization. So they had to take on this Etruscan civilization in the northern part of Italy, and then the Greek city-states to the south. And so they did. And bit by bit, you had some notes that you shared with me, and some of the things you've got into it too. And there's some really intriguing stories about their wars with the Etruscans. Early, up until 500, we'll say 509, up until the year 509, so 244 years after the founding of Rome, Rome itself had kings, and it happened to be mostly Etruscan kings. We know this by their names. And so there was this real interchange between the two societies, between the Etruscans. The Romans were borrowing a tremendous amount they borrowed the Greek alphabet from the Etruscans, which became what we call the Roman. It was the Western Greek alphabet. I talked about that in a previous episode. And they used this alphabet, which became the Roman alphabet.
Is part of that to help with things like trade, though? Because, they got their, if they're trying to improve, relationships.
We're talking about centuries here, right? This is not something, a war like World War II, which lasted 6 years in Europe. These are centuries and decades going by. And so, Etruscans and the Romans had trade, they had interchange, intermarriage, right. All sorts of ways of connecting with one another, and borrowing and lending and taking and giving, and including the Greek city-states to the south, who were this tremendous, rich source of culture and wealth and affluence. And so the Romans were benefiting both from the Etruscans. The intriguing thing, one of the most intriguing things about the Etruscans, we have their sarcophagi, which are these tremendous tombs that they built. A lot of their, some of the walls, their cities. We have the ruins, the Etruscan ruins, and we have literally thousands of different examples of their script, of their written language, their alphabet. We can't read it. We have not yet deciphered it. Little scraps here and there, but it's amazing with all the computer programs you think of, with all the software. And scholars have not yet been able to decipher and decode the Etruscan language. It's that different from the Roman language, from the Latin language. And the way the Romans adapted this Western Greek, the Roman alphabet is different than the Etruscan, even though it's based on that model, which is all based on the original Phoenician alphabet. We'll get back to them. They come into the Roman story through Carthage. So, for example, early war against the Etruscans. The Roman society, the Roman culture was being built upon the idea that citizens participated, much like Athens. It was called the Roman Republic, and they had, the base of it was their Senate, and the Senate was early days was about 300 important citizens of Rome, and these were the governing people, and from them would become the two executives. Every year there'd be two consuls who ran the Senate, sat in the Senate, and they would have a one-year term. And this was the Roman government, and it was from the patrician, the aristocratic class. And then they had the plebeians, and this is Roman society. And these were everybody else. Eventually they became a third middle class, but that was a little bit later, the equestrians. And the idea, so the Senate was the one who basically ran the city-state. So there was a representative assembly, just like the Assembly of 500 in Athens. And the one thing they could do, though, in times of crisis is call up a general, one of the Roman generals, and they modeled their military on the Spartans. In fact, the Roman military handbook was the Spartan military handbook. And they would call up a general, and he could become a dictator. It's a Roman word. It just means speaker, much like president just means a person who sits or resides, and or presides, right? And so they would call up a general to become a dictator for a temporary amount of time for the duration of the crisis. And in one of their wars against the Etruscans, there is a famous Roman general who became a dictator called Cincinnatus. The city Cincinnati is named after him. And he became a hero to the Romans because they always feared dictators, because there had been these Etruscan kings who functioned as dictators, as tyrants over the Roman state. And they did not want dictators themselves. They did not even want Roman dictators or generals to become dictators. So this notion was you could become a dictator, and then once the crisis was over, you end your term. And Cincinnatus did that. He became a general. He led the Roman legions in the field against the Etruscans. He defeated the Etruscans. And within 17 days after defeating the Etruscans, he went back to his farms. And this is like, you had made a connection, I noticed, to George Washington, the gentleman farmer, right? Who came, he served, he did his country's duty. He reluctantly took on the job of president. And we have all these founding myths about George Washington, right? Do you remember the cherry tree and throwing the silver dollar across the Delaware River? And so the story of Cincinnatus became a role model for the Romans of how a state should be governed. Right? Yeah, okay, a dictator for a very short time. He served the state. As soon as his service to the state, he accomplished it, he returned to his fields and began, of course, the production for the good, the wine, the wheat, whatever it was that he produced on his estates. Another story about Horatius, the Legionnaire Horatius at the bridge, by himself, single-handedly, like Audie Murphy in World War II or Sergeant York in World War I. He held off thousands of Etruscans. It's kind of like the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, for a period of time that enabled the Roman army, the legion behind him, to get to a place of safety back to Rome behind the walls to where they could defend the city. And Horatius at the bridge, you're making this tremendous stand. He himself died. He sacrificed himself for the good of Rome. And so they have these stories. And they defeated the Etruscans. They threw off the last Etruscan tyrant or king, the Tarquin, in 509. He was an ancestor of Brutus, the Marcus Brutus, who was one of the senators who assassinated Julius Caesar in 44 BC, March 15th, the Ides of March. So this great Brutus in 509, along with other senators, were able to defeat the Tarquin. what they say is that this Etruscan king, that his brother raped this Roman patrician woman, and she killed herself then in her shame and disgrace. And so the Romans rose up against this Etruscan tyrant and threw him out. So they see the founding of the Roman Republic to 509. There's a really good chance that this story is very accurate. And even the date, perhaps, by then, because they had written records, Latin had become, they had the alphabet, they were a literate society by then, and this is always the date that they've thrown out. So this begins that Rome now is a power in the Italian peninsula. And over the story they have subdued, the Etruscans were pretty much done as a rival to Rome by the 300s. We're talking about the 4th century BC. The Romans also had other people that they were having problems with, a group called the Gauls. That the Gaul is modern day France, and the Gauls actually right after the Romans had defeated the Etruscans, the Gauls, these Celtic barbarians, illiterate, big, tall, blonde-haired, having all sorts of wonderful rites, Celtic rite. These are the people with their priests were called Druids. The most intensely populated Celtic part of the world was Gaul or France, not Scotland and Ireland. They were amongst the least, but that's why they remained Celtic. And so the Gauls actually came and conquered Rome. They not only sacked it, but they stayed for a while in 390 BC. So this was the Gauls. But then the Gauls agreed to be bribed. So if you give us enough money, and this was again where the women stepped up. The Romans didn't have enough gold to give to the Gauls, but there were these wealthy women, matrons in Rome, who had inherited the estates of their deceased husbands or fathers, and they came together with the rest of the gold, and they gave it to the Gauls, and so the Gauls retreated, right? And so the Romans, it was always, Edward Gibbon in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire said, sometimes vanquished in battle, the Romans were. It happens, right? The story of Pyrrhus, which we'll tell in a moment, the king of Epirus, but always victorious in war. Sometimes vanquished in battle, always victorious in war. And this is pretty much the story, right, of Rome.
Before I forget it, in the first sacking from the Gauls, I remember, and I don't know if this is myth or legend, but essentially they were paying them with gold, and the scales, the Romans basically complained that the scales were not accurate, and that the leader of I can't remember the leader of the Gauls at that point, but basically the legend goes he threw his sword on the scale to make it even more so unbalanced, and uttered the woe to the conquered, or basically the fact of shut up, you're the ones, we're making the terms here.
And this is so ironic, but it's interesting. It wasn't until Julius Caesar that Gaul was vanquished. Gaul was there to the northwest as this tremendous power. These were very organized, barbaric, tremendously powerful in war tribes that existed up until the 1st century BC, and then they were vanquished by Julius Caesar. That's his most famous victory. He wrote about it, Julius Caesar. And again, I'm jumping ahead now, but he wrote the War of the Gauls against the Gauls. And that's it's probably his most famous.
Yeah, and I think that's good to talk about. And it's for me, I love asking these questions because so many of these areas, the Etruscans and the Gauls, and these different players and the Greeks and down to the Carthaginians. They come in over the course of not just an episode or a small war. They tend to be themes.
Not like World War I, which was 4 years, or the Civil War, which was 4 years, or World War II. These were centuries. These were migrations of people. These are people, and these are things that happened over hundreds of years. And so the Carthaginian Wars, as you know, it lasted 140 years. Who's going to be the great power that dominates and defines the Western world, Rome or Carthage? Well, Rome. We know. How do we know Rome won? Well, who's heard of Carthage? Even that famous, the Latin phrase, Carthago delenda est. It means Carthage is deleted. Carthage is annihilated. When they finally defeated the Carthaginians, they, as you know, it gets exaggerated what the Romans did, but they ended them.
And I love...
and again, the Americans love that story. It really resonates with us that, wow, they had this tremendous adversary foe, right? Like our superhero stories. And when they finally defeated their greatest nemesis, they utterly destroyed them. Even burnt their records and everything. But we'll get back to the Carthaginians. And again, I'll try to... So this is where we got the Etruscans. So by the 4th century BC. Now this is right. This is at the time Socrates died. He killed himself in 399. So we're talking about the time that the Etruscans are defeated is when Socrates killed himself, the end of the golden age of Athens. And we're within sight of Alexander. Alexander becomes king at the age of 20 in 336 BC. So what are the Romans doing when Alexander becomes king of Macedonia and conqueror of Greece and the Persian Empire and everything else, right? Creates his own empire. Well, the Romans are taking care of the Greek city-states, right? That's the next logical place to go. Why not? Okay, we got the Etruscans. And what was really such a telling part about the Roman administration, they began to develop a very organized system of government through the Senate. They had juries. They created jurisprudence. The whole notion of laws to this day, that is why every lawyer is afflicted with the study of Latin when they go to law school, because virtually most of the legal concepts are in Latin. Habeas corpus, of course, is one of the most famous, but it goes on from there. And so they created a series of alliances with all of central Italy. And what they do is, if you join us, we're the most affluent, we're the most prosperous, we're the most powerful. Join us. And they said, sure. The Roman bandwagon looks pretty cool. They're doing well. Let's. And also what happens then, eventually then they could become citizens. They could become citizens of this Roman state. And they could vote. Then they became, eventually, it took a while, but they had, the Romans, one of the ways were organized were through 35 tribes. We'll call them tribes. That's or they're called comites or cities, committees, but that doesn't sound right. So we call them tribes. And these were the people who voted and elected the consuls in theory and the senators. And at first it was only the patricians, and that's one of the stories we might get into, is eventually how the plebeians get more and more of a role, a stake. All of this period from really, let's say from 450 BC to 50 BC is the story of the plebeians getting more and more power and becoming more and more a part of the Roman state and becoming Roman citizens. It took 400 years for that process to take place. So again, that's much longer than the United States has even existed.
Yeah, and some of that's funny because
it's big scope.
Parallels too, because and we can talk about this, and maybe we'll have time today. But obviously, even restricting and marriage and castes and just this kind of this idea of who could access what. Even though what's funny or what's interesting about the two kind of classes is yet they both participated heavily when called up to serve in military.
Absolutely, they were very conservative minded. For the first two, let's say from the establishment of Rome as a power, let's say in 400 BC, the plebeians were happy with their lot in life because they were fairly affluent. They were doing pretty well. They were succeeding, and they were living off the fruits of the success of the Roman state. And so they were, when I say conservative, they were happy to let the senators and the patricians run the state. But the patricians made up maybe 10 to 15% of the people in Rome and the outlying districts, which eventually became Rome, and then it of course kept expanding. And so this is really interesting, this great gift of becoming a member of Rome. Like today, American citizenship, it is desired by people who want, just have an American passport, to be part of Rome. One of the great success stories of the ancient world is this Jewish fellow from a city called Tarsus in southern Turkey, and he goes to Israel, and he at first he's one of the tormentors of this Jewish sect called Christians. These Jewish people who believed that this carpenter fellow who had been crucified by the Romans was the Messiah, was the long-awaited Messiah. And he was one of the people who really harassed and even tortured the Christians. But he was going to Damascus to take on the Christians up there, and he had his great revelation. This is St. Paul. St. Paul then was the fellow who expanded Christianity from beyond Israel. And how could he do this? Well, now we're talking about the 1st century BC. Well, actually 1st century AD, of course, after Jesus. So we're talking about the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, in the 1st century. And for decades, he created these churches throughout the the Eastern, and even West. He went to Rome, St. Paul, like St. Peter did. And he could travel because he was a Roman citizen. He was from a Roman city, Tarsus, and even though he's Jewish, the Romans were very. If your city surrendered, if you joined willingly the Roman Empire, the growth, the power, the glory that was Rome, the Romans were very forgiving, and they realized that it was more successful to be friends. And that's how they won most of their battles in many ways. That they would get these alliances. So sometimes vanquished in battle, but always victorious in war, because people more often than not joined with them. And also they didn't want to go up against the Romans, because what did the Romans do to you if you fought against the Romans and you lost? Well, they destroyed
you.
They enslaved, they killed all the men and enslaved all the women, and nobody wanted that, right? So the only people who really took on the Romans were those who thought they could maybe defeat them. And we'll get to them. The Etruscans thought that, but they failed. How do you think the southern Greek city-states fared? I began with the story of Archimedes living in Syracuse. So what happens to those southern Greek, the Greek polis, the 55 or so that existed in southern Italy, one by one, through the 3rd century BC?
And
they fell, right? One by one, these series of alliances, as the Romans expanded southwards, they conquered the old Magna Graecia, right? The Greater Greece. And so really right at in fact, it's what brought on the war against this Carthage. I'll have to tell you, explain a little bit about Carthage, because Carthage had an investment in the island of Sicily. And so the Romans, in conquering southern Italy, in conquering the Greek city-states, and incorporating and assimilating Greek culture, Greek gods, Greek literature, Greek philosophy, Greek science, Greek engineering in particular, right? The Romans weren't interested in building beautiful things necessarily. They wanted glorious and grand buildings. And they wanted tremendous pragmatic architecture and engineering, like the aqueducts, the 14 great aqueducts that feed the city of Rome at the height of the Roman Empire. At the height of the Roman Empire, in the 1st century AD, at the time of Jesus, right, there was more water, fresh water, coming into the city of Rome to enable and empower the 1 million people living in the city than there was water going into New York City today. 8 million people in New York City, the 5 boroughs, right? More water went into Rome through the 14 aqueducts than goes into Rome. Now, part of it is because New York City has reservoirs, all the water towers, whereas in Rome, for the most part, they did have reservoirs. They understood the concept. But for the most part, it was water that was just flowing constantly through the sewers, into the fountains, into the homes, into their spigots, which they had. They had running water in their homes. But again, we're talking a little bit ahead of it. So I'll finish this story, and then maybe we can talk about some of those things that made Rome so efficient, right? What made them endure for so long, not just politically, but the engineering. Sure. So here, to make it really simple, they defeat the Etruscans. They defeat the Greeks to the south. So they got all of the Italian peninsula. The problem was there's this huge, massive island called Sicily, and this is where you can put up one of your maps, right? Right now we don't see it, but Ryan's very good at coming up with these wonderful graphics. And there were Carthaginian colonies. And there was one called Messana. And in Messana, they had Italian soldiers, mercenaries who were connected, had been assimilated into the expanding Roman state. And they were the protectors of the city of what became known as Messina. Mm-hmm. And a nearby colony called Syracuse was threatening Messana. And the Roman mercenaries there were not quite enough to necessarily defeat Syracuse. And so this is before the Romans actually conquered Syracuse. Mm-hmm. And they called Carthaginians, Carthaginians, who are they? Who are the Carthaginians? Well, they're part of the Phoenician people. Phoenicians were the maritime people who were back in Lebanon. They were the ones who came up with the alphabet, which influenced the Greek alphabet, which became the Roman alphabet and the Greek alphabet. They had been conquered by Alexander the Great. However, they had spread colonies throughout the Western Mediterranean. They were so effective as seafarers. And this, like that story of the city of Tyre, they were Phoenicians. Mm-hmm. Tyre was the city where Alexander the Great built the causeway from the mainland out to this island city called Tyre, Tyre. And one of the great stories is, right, that the people of Tyre fled. And they went west, and they founded the city of Carthage in what is now Tunisia in northern Africa. And at that point, it wasn't the Sahara Desert. It was beautiful grasslands. And it became this powerful maritime state. They developed colonies all throughout North Africa, in the islands Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the 3 giant islands to the west of Italy, and then also in Spain. All of the eastern coast of Spain was Carthaginian. So they had this vast Mediterranean maritime empire. So as the Roman state expands and becomes a real power and really confident and are growing into their military, So it was inevitable. What happened then, of course, is the Carthaginians came in. They also joined in with the defense of the city of Messina, I'll call it Messina, right? And they defeat the Syracuse. And then after they defeated the people from Syracuse, the Carthaginians didn't want to leave. And so the Roman mercenaries who were there in Messina said, you have to leave. This is our city. We're the mercenaries here. And the Carthaginians said, well, no, you couldn't have won without our help. What are you talking about? It sounds like the alliances in World War I and World War II, right? We still have military bases in Germany, Italy, and Austria, right? In Japan and South Korea. God bless us. So the Romans wanted it. The Carthaginians wanted it. So what happens? What just accidentally happens? War. In 264 BC, the Roman Empire, can we call it that? Sure, we'll call it that, goes to war against the Carthaginian Empire. And these are called the Punic Wars. Punic is the Roman Latin word for Phoenician. So they were aware of the fact that the Carthaginians were Phoenicians. So it begins from 264 to really 146 BC, the three Punic Wars. So we had the Peloponnesian War between the Spartans and Athenians. Oftentimes students get confused. It is hard, right? The Peloponnesian Wars, and then we have now the Punic Wars, and this includes Hannibal and his war elephants. So the Romans and the Carthaginians go at it. And before I get into any kind of story about it, who wins? Does Rome win? I know I've already brought this up. Or does Carthage win?
Rome wins?
Yeah, good guess. Good guess. Good. Educated guess there, right? They do win. And in 146 BC, Carthage is deleted. They basically highlight the Carthaginian Empire on their computer screen and push the delete button. And so Carthago delenda est, Carthage is deleted, is finished, annihilated. They also then had to contend, they went east. In fact, as they were beginning to take the Greek city-states to the south of Italy, the Greek city-states appealed to a king named Pyrrhus in what is now Albania. And it was called the Kingdom of Epirus, Epirus. It's on the western coast of Greece. Albania, right? It's just north of Greece on the western, the Peloponnesian, not Peloponnesian, but the Greek peninsula, the Balkan peninsula. And so the Kingdom of Epirus, and he thought, the Romans are getting too big for their britches, and it's only 70 miles from Italy to Epirus to Albania. From the way the Italian peninsula goes, it goes from northwest to east, southeast, and it's at the bottom. It's only 70 miles from Greece and Albania. So King Pyrrhus, Pyrrhus, I don't know, U.S., right? Pyrrhus. He invades Italy with Rome, right? With his armies. He has war elephants, just like Hannibal does in the Carthaginian Wars, the Punic Wars later. And the Romans use the techniques just like in Lord of the Rings with Sam Gamgee's Oliphants, right? And they use ropes and other means to pour down the war elephants. It was also, what other movie?
Yeah, I even saw a comparison that they said that they use chariots to tie the elephants up, just like Star Wars and the Battle on Hoth.
Yeah. Right, exactly. With in the second Empire, Empire Strikes Back, with those huge walking. That's a ridiculous form of warfare, right? In this other galaxy a long time ago. Right, they use similar, right? They get their legs all trained. Yeah, they had also the caltrops, which they would throw underneath, like under horses. Caltrops look like jacks, but they're really sharp and they're much bigger. And so you throw them under elephants' feet, and the elephants aren't going to like it, right? They step out of them, and so the elephants fall, and then they're easy to kill. But actually, King Pyrrhus won 2 different battles against the Romans, but they were so unbelievably costly to this king that he had to retreat back to his kingdom of Epirus, and he said, I'm done. I'm sorry, Greek city-states, but I can't help you anymore. It beggared our state. I have no more gold reserves. My army is decimated. We'll get back to that word. Decimated. It comes from what the Roman practice, what they did in their centuries, which was a unit within their legions. And so that's what the word Pyrrhic victory, it's a word which is fairly common usage, and it means a victory which is so costly it's just not worth it. Like for France in World War One, they were the main winner in World War One. People don't know that. We like to think the Americans, but the French were the ones who sacrificed the most by far. And they went toe-to-toe with the Germans, and they defeated them. However, to what cost? Well, to an easy victory for the Germans in World War II. The French were so devastated. It's unbelievable when you look at I'm just going to say this short statement. How many French people died? If you were 18 years old in 1896, so that means if you were born in 1896 in France, and you were 18 in 1914. Only 1 out of 5 of those young men were alive in 1918. 4 out of 5 of the French boys who were born in 1896 survived World War One. So that's definitely a Pyrrhic victory, isn't it? World War One for the French.
Yeah, we're familiar with...
And we can see that because most Americans, what they know about is the French losing and surrendering in World War II, not the French victory in World War One. And they think the only way the French got victory was because of our timely intervention, and that's exaggerated.
Yeah, I think of also Pyrrhic victories in terms of a lot of guerrilla warfare. You think of Vietnam, or you think of more recent, where it's a battle you can win by force, but because the enemy they have ways or they have the advantage, they can actually make it
just keep
very costly.
Right? You can't defeat them. You can't find them, right? Because they're out in the countryside. They retreat. Yeah. We can go in and destroy the villages, but you're only getting a couple of the guerrilla fighters that way. And so eventually, right, to make it really simple, they defeat Carthage to the south. They go east. So really, it's interesting. The Carthaginian, the war against Carthage, the Punic Wars end in 146, the same year that they conquered Macedonia and Greece. So the Romans have legions. They had about 280,000 to 300,000 men at arms. We're talking in the 2nd century BC. They had with the 15 legions or so that they had. It's actually much more than that. Legions were they became 4,800 men, 4,800 infantry, a legion. But then they would have cavalry assist, so about 6,000 men. So of course they had actually, we're talking, I guess about 5 legions. No, that's 30. Excuse me, 50 legions. There we go. Yeah, it makes sense because we're talking about the 16th to 26th legions. If you know about the story, the glory of the different legions, and the lost legions and the lost banners and those things which are so important to the Romans. But so they conquered good old Greece, and they were most of the Greek city-states surrendered. Sparta could not fight the Romans. They had 500 men at arms at the time in 146 when the Romans came to Greece. What can 500 men do against a legion of 6,000 organized Romans on the Spartan model, right? And they used a different military strategy. They had given up on the phalanx, and they were using these maniples, these squares, which were just as effective as the phalanx or the triangle. And the Greek city-states were conquered. Then the Romans kept going. They went into Asia. What they called Asia was Western Turkey. And so it is intriguing. That's where we, to this day, think of as Asia beginning. Yeah, Asia was not all of what we consider this tremendous continent, which you see in the game of Risk on the Risk board. Asia was Turkey to them. It's a Roman word, from a Greek word. So many of the Roman words, of course, were based on Greek origins, and so we have all those words: philosophy and geography and geology and mathematics, which are all Greek words that the Romans used. But Latin, most of Latin, percentage-wise, was Latin. But they, probably 20% or so was Greek. This is a pure guess, so I actually don't know. I should, given the fact that I teach history of the English language, but I don't. In English itself, words that are in English language in common usage, it's about 4% that are Greek origin. And Latin is up to about 21%. And most of the Latin words in the English language came to us through the French when the French conquered England in the 11th century. Over 40% of our words are French vocabulary. So between French and Latin, it's about 2/3 of our vocabulary in the English language is French or Latinate, because French is a Latin language. So then they by the 2nd century, they've conquered all of the Eastern Mediterranean, and they've made an alliance with Egypt. And that brings us eventually into the 1st century, where eventually the alliance includes Julius Caesar having this affair with the Queen of Egypt. She was not Egyptian. She was Macedonian, descended from the Alexander. Alexander's ancestors who remained in power in Egypt because he had conquered it during his, in the Hellenistic period that followed his conquest of Egypt. So all of the Ptolemies, she was part of the Ptolemy family. The 14 generations or so that preceded from the time of Alexander to Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt in the 1st century, right at the time of Christ, right? And Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Mm-hmm. So Julius Caesar is assassinated. Caesar had conquered, in the meantime, he'd conquered France, Gaul, finally defeated those pesky barbarians he defeated some of the Germanic tribes, which were farther in northeastern Europe. He and his good buddy, well, he didn't, but Pompey, another great general at this time, conquered all of Spain. So by the 1st century, the Roman Empire now includes basically all of Western Europe, all of the Eastern Mediterranean, and of course the old Carthage, Northern African Empire. It's called the guy who, and again, we'll go into the Punic Wars in another episode. The Roman general who defeated finally the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War was Scipio Cornelius. What was his? Publius Cornelius Scipio, and eventually he becomes known as Africanus, and because he conquered Carthage, the Romans called it Africa. So Africa, we've heard of that, and so Asia, Africa, Germania. Germania is what they call the part outside of their empire, and just means neighbors, and so that's where the word German comes from. The Germans don't call themselves Germans.
That's right.
They have a word going back to Germanic. They're Deutsch, right? Other people call them the Alemanni, which was one of the Germanic tribes, but that's again for later on. And so this was, this, and then so they get all of Western Europe, and Julius Caesar actually went up to Britain, to the island of Britain. He didn't conquer it, but he explored the idea. It was in the 1st century AD that the island of Britain was conquered. The Romans didn't want Scotland, this Celtic people, these barbarians, so they built a huge wall across northern England. The Hadrians, Emperor Hadrian, in the 2nd century AD, they were not interested in Ireland. They saw nothing of value there in Ireland. No potatoes yet, right? That doesn't come until the New World. So they left the barbaric Irish tribes, Celtic tribes alone, and the same with the Welsh for the most part. Wales, which is in western Britain. So that's why those regions remain Celtic. All of Western Europe had been Celtic, and then the Romans come along. And so all of this remains for hundreds of years. That doesn't end until the 5th century, until specifically the last Roman emperor was in 476 AD, so 440 years after the death of Christ. Really, that Roman Empire in the West doesn't fade as a civilized template until, in the 500s in the 6th century. But it's pretty quick. It was amazing how quickly literacy and engineering, science, math, all those things vanished because of the barbarians who were coming in, the Germanic tribes that finally broke into the empire for different reasons. And so that's it. The story, they established a bunch of forts in the Middle East, in what is now Iraq and Syria and those countries, which would basically patrol and govern trade with the East, including China. The Romans had lots of trade with the Chinese Empire, thousands of miles to the east, and the empires in India as well. They got the spices from that area. So many things that came from Asia, the trade routes, and they had these forts that were set in the desert out there in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, and Jordan, which were usually they were in line of sight. And so they would have these forts set up to govern the trade routes. They were set in squares. They would have a garrison of about 250 people, soldiers, legionnaires, right? And so when these trade routes would come, if the trade routes would signal that nomadic bandits were attacking them, the Romans would come riding out, and then they would signal. They would use semaphores or fires to signal these other forts that were maybe a few miles away within line of sight. And within minutes, really, we're talking 20 minutes, they would have 500 miles of their eastern frontier notified that there was some kind of breach in their security of the Eastern Empire. And in the West, of course, they had complete control, domination over all of Western Europe, Northern Africa, going way up to beyond the Rhine River into what we would now call Poland. And so they conquered all of what is Romania. Romania? How does it get that name? The Romanian language way over there in northeastern Balkan part, it borders on Russia, was a Roman conquest. It was called Dacia when it was conquered. And so that was the story, right? So how did this happen, right? We've been talking, I know, for probably over an hour at this point. But to give you a few notions of Roman logistics, right? They had this incredibly organized system of government that was very attractive to these other states that surrounded them, to these other tribes, to these other groups of people. And in most cases, people joined this expanding, powerful, organized people willingly because of the prosperity that was promised, the promise that eventually they could perhaps even gain citizenship within the empire, that they would not be enslaved. Like most other people, all the other empires prior to them had always enslaved. The Romans would enslave people if you resisted, of course. So Carthaginians, well, they were all killed. All the men were killed. They enslaved the women and children. The same thing with the Etruscans, because that was a little bit different. But the Gauls at different times in the wars that went on there, they enslaved, not millions, but well over 100,000 Gauls, in a period, a few hundred years. And that's, of course, the Roman Empire, so much of their success is built upon slavery. That they had this, and it's also, this is an intriguing idea. People have often asked, why didn't the Renaissance, why didn't modern science and industry begin with the Romans? Because they were so advanced, right? With the aqueducts, their engineering, these tremendous accomplishments. To give you an idea, you mentioned Roman roads. Within the Roman Empire, there were 25,000 miles of paved roads, which are still amongst the most perfect roads built in Europe. Most of them still exist. 25,000 miles, if you remember Rattasini's measurements, is enough to go around the world one time. So they had made that much paved roads. Well, what was the purpose? So what could move fast, quickly on those paved roads? Legions, armies, right? Merchants, trade, and also their postal service. You could get from someone on one of those forts way out in the desert east of Jordan, right? Way down there north of Saudi Arabia. They could send a letter to an outpost up on Hadrian's Wall and, on the border of Scotland. And how long do you think it would take for it to reach there? The Roman Pony Express, Roman Postal Service.
A couple months.
6 weeks. It went that fast. In general, letters, they traveled a little more than 100 miles a day. That's incredible, right? It's the fastest really until trains. It's faster than our Pony Express. Roman legions, Julius Caesar, they in general would march 25 miles a day. If you've ever gone on a hike, you go 10 miles and wow, you feel like you've accomplished something. These armies on these roads would march. And they had another 200,000 miles of roads, of dirt roads that they had within the Roman Empire. So enough to go around the world, we're talking 9 times more. So 25,000 miles of paved roads, another 200,000 miles of dirt roads. So unbelievably connected, right? They established their forts, their cities throughout their entire empire, all of it governed from the central city of Rome. But they used governors in all of their provinces. The area of Provence in France was one of their first provinces outside of Italy, so that's why it's called the province, or Provence. That's why Provence is called Provence. It was the first really valuable, rich, lush province of the Roman Empire. And you go to Provence, and some of the greatest Roman ruins are in Provence. The cities of southern France have these arenas that seated 25,000 people because they had the Gladiatorial Games everywhere. If you remember in the movie Gladiator, where Maximus began, that was in North Africa. That was the idea that place there where he went to after he'd been left for dead was not in Spain. It was supposed to be in North Africa in the old Carthaginian footprint there. But yeah, they had arenas. There's a tremendous arena in Carthage, when the Romans rebuilt Carthage, that sat 50,000 people, just like the Colosseum in Rome. And so these were the types of things that enabled them. The running water with the aqueducts. Probably the most famous one is the Pont du Gard, and we'll have to get an image of that. It's just amazing. The Pont du Gard was 35 miles that went to the Roman city of Nimes. It's what we call it now in southern France. And it spanned this valley, and this unbelievable structure, and the water would travel in the front, but it's just these series of arches and levels in it, 4 different levels, and it's over 200 feet high, and its sole purpose is to carry water. The Greeks never built anything on that scale for pragmatic purposes. The Romans just had this infrastructure. They brought in, there's 1 million people living in the city of Rome, so you can imagine the logistics, right? They got in enough food because no food was grown in Rome, in the city of Rome. It was urban. And so we should look at Mussolini's model also that he had built in the 1930s to try to equate that the Italy of the modern world was like ancient Rome. And so he had this tremendous, which is about the size of the basketball gym floor, a model of Rome, just to show how urban it was. So they brought in enough food for 1 million people every day, enough water for 1 million people to bathe every day, to drink, to wash your dishes, do everything, right? They had toilets, public baths. They had their act together. So this is why they endured, right? From, let's say, their great military triumph from 300, by the time of 300 BC, when they were beginning to dominate, until 500 AD, for 800 years, this Roman Empire endured and continued to survive. It had its ups and downs, a real roller coaster ride. And there'll be certain things. We will want to talk about the end of the Republic and the rise of the warlords and how Julius Caesar and Pompey and Crassus ended it, and it all came to an emperor, Caesar Augustus. And for the last 500 years of the Western Roman Empire, it was an empire governed by an emperor and not the Senate, and it was no longer a republic. How they established a second, an emperor in the 4th century named Constantine creates a second capital in a Greek city-state called Byzantium. And it becomes, he wanted to call it New Rome, Nova Roma. Roma was actually an Etruscan word. That's what they called the people of the Latium Valley. But eventually the Romans adopted the Etruscan word for themselves, so they used Roma. And that's how you say it in Latin, Rome. We use the French word for Rome. All the Italian cities we use are the French words, because our connection in the modern world, in the Renaissance, with the Italian Renaissance was through France. And so the words for those cities, and that's
I love.
So these are this amazing thing, right? The Romans, that they accomplished, the different connections, and it is so complex, right? Then how did the empire rise? How does it fall? How does it continue in the East after it falls in the West? And it's just this. It's one of the most epic stories in human history, probably the most. This is the ultimate empire we're talking about. And it sets the template so much. We use the Roman language. We use the Roman way. We are so Roman in our lives, in our games, in our entertainments. We're not like the cerebral, abstract thinking Greeks. Leave that for the French, right? We much more value the men of action, the idea of the expansion, the power, this dream of being a state with a destiny like the Romans believed in. And so that's so much part of the Roman legacy as well. Not just the buildings, the architecture, the art, the language, the legal system, government itself, the structure of government, but it's that cultural imprint embedded inside of us of what it is to be a successful state. And we have chosen Rome as the model.
Yeah, and it's so much why I think these topics are so dense, is because, to your point, we can literally go on and pull up history after history of all of the things, and there's so much there. And I think oftentimes you forget that influence because it's so disconnected from that disconnection from the modern day evolution of what it's become. Oftentimes we don't have to look back at history unless we're reminded, or we see we happen to stumble across a documentary on Netflix or a YouTube video that comes across showing
Yeah, most people, that's the thing. Everyone, I think every American has, you ask Rome, right? And they can summon up people in togas, gladiatorial games. You mentioned chariots. I think virtually everyone knows what a chariot is. A chariot race would look like. We have Little Caesars, pizzeria, in so many commercials, the toga. It's just Saturday Night Live, toga parties, Animal House. It's everywhere, right? People have images of Rome. We know what a Roman legion looks like. We know what a Roman soldier. They're the mascots for our football teams. They're just Spartans, Romans, Trojans. And so I suppose this is an awful lot tonight, but this is the sort of the backstory, the origin story, the backstory, the scope. We're talking, and the thing is, we say, okay, that's 1,200 years from 753 BC until 476 AD, when the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustus, was killed by a barbarian Germanic king, Ostrogothic king, Odoacer. But the Romans didn't, in the West, they continued, of course, and had influence. But in the East, in Constantinople, the Roman Empire went on. And in theory, really, in reality, it did not fall until 1453. Only, we're talking 550 years ago. So it was the Ottoman Turks who conquered it and renamed it, Istanbul. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we get the song from. They might be giants, Istanbul, Constantinople. It was Byzantium, and then Constantinople, and then Istanbul. This city that is partly in Europe and partly in Asia, that bestrides the isthmus between the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, from the Black Sea down into the Mediterranean. So it's intriguing that the Roman Empire remained organized in the East for hundreds of years. Let's say by the year 900, how Roman was the Byzantine Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean? And that's a question we'll leave for later, right? Is it really Roman any longer? They call themselves Romans, but in the West, we always refer to the Romans as the people from Rome, and the Western Empire fell, and so the Roman Empire became other things. It became Germanic and modern-day kingdoms, the first one to emerge. And we can say that the Roman Empire ended in the West because the first barbaric Germanic kingdom was the kingdom of the Franks. And the kingdom of the Franks is the word that became France. It just means Franks. So it's intriguing. What? The French are Germanic? Well, it turns out that everyone in Western Europe, the Germanic peoples came into all of the Western Roman Empire. What had been Celtic and then Roman became Germanic. And so this was what happened in the West. And in the East, of course, what we call the Byzantine Empire. People in Greece, they still call it the Roman Empire, because it was part of the Roman Empire. And they called them, even though they spoke Greek, they also spoke Latin, but they considered themselves the real inheritors of the Roman Empire after it fell in the West. I just read a book about that very thing recently, a book that was written by a scholar at San Diego State. So this is the tremendous scope of this ultimate empire. We're talking well over 1,000 years, arguably, 1,700, 1,800 years that this Roman Empire, if we go to 1453, we're talking over 2,000 years. Wow. That's, I guess, what we can say about the Roman Empire. Wow. Its impact upon the modern world, even though we can say that the summit, the apex of the Roman Empire was probably, during the reign of Augustus, he established peace because he conquered everything. And the Roman emperors who came after him for the next 200 years, up to Marcus Aurelius, the emperor at the beginning of the opening of the movie Gladiator in 180 AD, that 200 years of peace because they had conquered everything. There was nothing left to conquer. Although that movie begins with the war fighting against the Germans who are outside. The German means neighbors. I don't know if I said that when I said, and they called Germania superior, Germania inferior, so upper Germania, lower Germania. And so they were the neighbors, the barbarians. Barbarian, the word barbarian, it comes from the Greeks originally and came into the Latin language. And it refers to the Greeks and the Romans who had these sort of elegant sounding Greco-Roman languages, these Mediterranean languages. You think of the Roman languages, Italian and French, they're so musical and poetic in their sound. And so Latin was that way. And so the Germanic, ich liebe dich, was ist los hier, was machen Sie? It just sounded guttural. And they said it was like bar, 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 bar. And so they called barbarians. That word came just from the sounds that they made. And so these were the people for 1,000 years who were on the outside of the Roman Empire, wanting to get in. The neighbors, they were called, right? The barbarians, the Germans. And that they get in eventually.
Yeah.
And so the Roman Empire falls. It declined and fell over hundreds of years. It was a long decline. And so that Pax Romana, which just means the peace of Rome, is a phrase and an idea which has endured to this age. The different tribes, when France dominated Europe and Napoleon, this idea that he had brought democracy to all of Europe, and so the Pax Franco, the French peace, the Pax Britannica from the British Empire, and now we call it the Pax Americana. That's what Americans really do want. We don't really want to conquer people and to wage war and bring war to people. We're always trying to help. We really our general. It's not just a matter of convincing or persuading ourselves that we're invading Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, just for conquest. We're not doing it for those reasons. We really are thinking we're trying to help. And that is an important American core value.
Yeah.
And so that we are really Pax Americana. That's what we love to be able to bring to the world. That this culture, this amazing industrial, technological culture, which is spreading throughout the world, and that if America could participate with the United Nations in creating some kind of international coalition of peace, we would love to play the dominating role in that. Of course, we're Roman in that way. And so again, that we even take that idea from that 200 years of peace, that when the Roman Empire really thrived, from let's say 30 BC until the year 200, AD,
Yeah.
Anno Domini, year of our Lord. And we'll say, BCE, I should be using BCE and CE. BCE, just to remind you folks out there, is before Common Era, and then CE is Common Era.
Yeah.
And so that replaced the BC and
AD.
AD, AD meaning not after death, which is what most people think, but it means Anno Domini, which is Latin, Roman, for year of our Lord.
Right.
Because eventually the Roman Empire becomes Christian before the fall.
And hopefully we'll get an opportunity to get into some of that I hope the downside. So
we know that we will, but we don't know if anyone wants to be listening. But
no, I think it's good.
Eventually, right? Yeah. This is out there, so maybe 100 years from now, this will be like some of the letters of Cicero or something, one of the great Roman leaders and orators of the first century BC.
Yeah, I think we'll have an opportunity to get into that, a little bit of the politics and some of the play, and I think some of these kind of end of these certain wars that bring in some of that and some of the logistics of the class system, and I think some of the political nature I think is important as we get into hopefully the kind of the downward side of the scope, which is why the build up and the overview, the orientation around all of these things is so, I think, contextually relevant, is because it then helps understand for, how could then something that really came to be such a powerhouse then eventually succumb to inevitably what would be downfall. Perfect. I think this has been, a very in-depth coverage. I love all these, the topics and where we can shed some light, and hopefully, opportunity to talk more on the Romans as we get through.
Much too long, and sorry about that, folks, but that happens. I know. What is this? Probably an hour and a half.
Yeah, so we'll make it through. Everyone, again, appreciate listening to the podcast. For those who are watching, continue to watch. Please share with friends, those who are friends with the podcast or would appreciate the content. Obviously, now I've educated everyone on the best way to watch and find for more information. Support the podcast. The best way to do that is thebestteacherpodcast.com. You can find all the links to support the channel, as well as all the mediums to watch, either from audio or video if you so choose. Other than that, I think we've covered at least a small, tiny fraction of Rome, but more to come shortly.
Exactly. So thank you, Ryan. You were very patient. Listen to me, carry on. I know because you've actually been looking into Roman history and looking and reading and watching YouTube channels, which are so effective. So I know that you too have a lot of background in this, and maybe we can include that more backwards and back and forth in the next episode.
Of course. As always, a pleasure. Come out with you more episodes, please.
Absolutely.
Appreciate everyone for joining in, and we'll talk to everyone soon.
Good night and good luck.
Phew.